Hello, this is Charlie Hoey. I've been doing a lot of blending stuff recently, and I've been learning lots from screencasts, so I thought I might set about to try and do one of my own. So this is my first one. We'll see how much I repeat myself and how many times I say, and then, so far about three. So I'm going to try and start pretty simple. We're going to try and make a three-ring binder like this. Which is something I'm working on for another project, which is a model of the War Room from Stanley Kubrick's Doctor Strangelove, which is a really interesting scene, but also polygonally actually fairly simple. So it was a good thing for me to start with. So some of the details I'm working on now are things like these ashtrays and these water glasses and things like that. But one of the things I sort of started working on today and thought might make a good tutorial is a three-ring binder. It's nice and low poly. It would be good as a game asset, but has a couple little details that are kind of neat. So let's just fire up Blender, and we're even going to just use our default cube here to start with. So the first thing that you want to do is find some dimensions for your object that you'd like to model. In this case, it's a pretty common one, and so the internet does that job pretty well for us. I just went to Staples and kind of found a three-ring binder that looks like it more or less matched the design I wanted, and it's got very precise dimensions right here that tell you exactly how large you should make it. Of course, we're not 3D printing or laser cutting or anything, so we don't need to really be too precise in Blender. We just want to get roughly the right idea. So we're just going to stick with Blender units, making it 9 or 10 or 11 Blender units large would make navigating the interface a little bulky. So what we're going to do is just move this decimal point over by 1, and then we'll just use that and we'll get the right relative dimensions for everything. So from your default cube here, you want to hit the N key, and that's going to bring up your panel over here that lets you see lots of information about the currently selected object, which is the cube. And what we're going to do is just set the dimensions directly. So we can go back to Staples and see that it's 9.7 by 1.3 by 11.4. And since we're just moving the decimal over a little bit to keep it a little bit more reasonable, we're going to make, let's see here, the x-axis is going to be the longest one here. So that's going to be 11.4 or 1.14. And then our width here is going to be the y-axis. That's 9.7 or 0.97. Oops, that's the scale. 0.97. And then the z is going to be the height, which is just 1.3 or 0.13 in our case. And there you go. We can hold down Control and zoom in, and that's looks about right. That's about what we're dealing with here for a binder. I tried a couple of different ways to do this and ran into it seems like it should be incredibly simple, but there's still a couple of different ways you can skin it. So what I found sort of worked the best is we can just mostly do our modeling with loop cuts. So hit the tab key, and that's going to bring you into edit mode here. And from here, we basically want to carve a little, cut away here, and then we'll end up with the skin of our binder. But we also want to be able to reposition this top flap depending on how many pieces of paper we have, or maybe we'd even want to move it around so that the whole thing was lying flat. And a good way to do that is just have a couple of extra loop cuts right here at the edge, and that's going to let you sort of deform your geometry without having any weird little kinks or anything over here. So the first thing we're going to do is hit Control R, and then we're going to hit the 3 key, and that's going to give us these 3 loop cuts that go all the way through the entirety of our mesh. And we're just going to hit Enter right there, and then Escape to just leave those all in the center. Of course, those are way too wide for what we want, so we're just going to hit S and Y, and that's going to scale these along the y-axis, and we can bring those in really pretty tight, because this, what we're modeling right here, if I can go back to my source, is just this right here, these sort of edges right here, where our binder is going to be able to bend. And so we want to just have a couple of very small edges there that we can bend around without causing too much deformation. So now if you hit the G and Y key, you can move just along the y-axis and reposition this right about there, like right near the edge. And there we go, there's that. And now we're going to just hit Control R one more time, and move over here so that we're going in the opposite direction, and hit 2 to make sure we make 2 cuts. Enter and escape again to just leave those cuts right in the middle. And this time we're going to hit S and Z to scale along the Z axis instead. And this is going to let us mark about where we want to make our cutout for the rest of the mesh here. So these top parts are going to become the covers of the binder, and then over here will be sort of the spine. So now that that's done, nothing has changed really in our mesh. It's all just adding vertices and edges that we can work with now. So we can pick the faces selection here, and then we're just going to pick these things that we want to get rid of. And so we can just sort of rotate around and select all of these because these need to go away. And so once you have those, just hit X and delete faces. And there you go. Now you're left with something that looks a bit more like a binder. Now, one thing you might notice if you get in real close is that it doesn't replace these faces on the inside. So you sort of have this concave kind of area here. And so we need to fill that in. And so we'll go down here and switch to vertex mode. And then we're just going to select all of these along the bottom part first. So these are just the sort of the top part of the bottom flap of the binder all the way to the edge. And then hit the F key and you'll fill that in with a face. We'll do the same thing here for the spine area. And you do want to be careful because these are fairly close, so I usually just rotate around to exactly where I'm looking. And we'll pick that edge there. Then we'll just pick this one and this one here and hit F to make one more face. And then lastly, just fill in this top one as well, which we'll just do all of this side first and then spin around here. And I'm just holding Shift and then right-clicking on each of these vertices as I do this. And that lets me sort of add to the selection until I'm ready to fill the vertices I've selected with a face. And so there we go. This is pretty much getting close to a binder. The next thing I like to do is sort of rough out the little parts in here. And this is one that I actually haven't really practiced yet for a screencast, so we'll see how this goes. The first thing you want to do, because we want to sort of add the metal part here that's going to be holding our paper, is select this inside face and hit Shift S and cursor to selected, and that's going to move our 3D cursor right to the center of the face on which we'd like to build. And then hit Tab to leave edit mode for object mode, and hit Shift A, and we're going to just add a cube. Why not? Obviously way too large, so just hit S and scale that way down. And here you want to just keep checking with your reference photos fairly often to just make sure you're more or less doing the right thing here. Again, I find a lot of, like Amazon and Staples and sites like that often have fairly large photos of a lot of these reference things, so you can sort of take a look, and this is the bit we're going to work on. So the first thing we're going to do is just put a little metal strip in the back and just leave it a rectangle for now. We're going to wait to do our sort of more detailed modeling until the end. This is sort of the blocking phase where we're just going to get some very rough geometry so that we more or less have the outermost shape of the thing we're making. So that looks like it's just a pretty thin rectangular piece that's just going to hang out right along the edge of our binder. So we can hit this and scale along the X and just bring that out. And because we used our cursor to center there on that face, it's going to be perfectly centered along the back there. It obviously shouldn't be poking through, so you hit S and Y, and we'll just shrink that down. And then we'll hit G and Y and just bring that up so it just intersects with that surface. And that looks pretty good. Is that looks like about the right distance. I'm actually going to bring that in just a little bit here. Okay, so that's the beginning, and then of course we have these other two things, which are these little tabs here that let us release the rings. So I think for that, let's go ahead into edit mode here and hit Control R, and we're going to make a loop cut right along the center line here. And what that's going to let us do, if we hit the B key and draw a little box along this side, and actually I'm going to do vertex mode, and I never knew what this was actually called. Let's see. Limit selection, that doesn't really roll off the tongue. We're going to do this so we can see basically an X-ray view of the vertices that we're working on. And that's going to let us just do this and select all of the vertices, whether they are visible from our particular view or not. And then we're just going to delete those. So now we're left with exactly half of that metal bar that we were hoping to model. And then if we go over here to the modifiers tab and add a mirror modifier to this, you'll see that it is restored just the way we wanted it. And now if we grab any vertices here, they are perfectly mirrored on the other side, and that's going to mean that we only have to design this little tab once, and it will be perfectly mimicked on this end as well. So to do that, we are going to, once again, use a fabulous loop cut. You can just hit enter here so it's in that dimension, and then we're going to slide it over, and basically what we're going to do is make it about so that the thickness of this will be what our tab is going to be. And so I'll hold shift down to really get that to be about right. And again, you know, we're just in the blocking phase, so that's going to let us keep a lot of flexibility in case we make a mistake here. That looks about right to me. And now I can switch to face mode and just pick that face and hit the E key, and that's going to extrude it. By default here, it seems to be extruding in the right direction, but you can also hit Y to really lock it into the global Y-axis and make sure that you're not going to go off, because we really want to keep all of these things really on perfect right angles if we can. So how does that look? Well, for starters, I'm sort of noticing, well, that actually looks okay. I think that our whole object here looks a little bit tall, so I'm going to hit S and Z and just scale that down just the tiniest bit. If I had better reference photos, there's a much more exact way to do this, but I think that we can probably get close enough here. And so from that looks about right. These really don't come too high up off of this back part here. So for this now, this sort of is an interesting shape. It's going to come up straight and kind of curve around. It almost looks like a can tab or something like that. So we're just going to play around here and see if something fits. We're going to hit S and Z, and we're going to scale this one face down, and that's going to give us a very sort of rough trapezoidy kind of shape, but we really want this to be nice and rounded up here. And so what I'm actually going to do is hit G and Y, and we're just going to bring this down quite a bit. Hit Shift and S and cursor to selected to get our cursor right where we want it. And I'm actually going to add in a circle. And basically what we're going to do here is, rather than trying to change a square into a perfectly round circle, we're just going to make a circle and then connect it to the square. We don't need 32 vertices, why not? Graphics cards are good. So what we're going to do here is scale this way down. If we can get selected here. Not sure what happened there. So we're just going to do this one more time. S and Z, get this down a little bit. Shift S, cursor to selected. Sometimes Blender is just going to do its thing, and that's okay. Okay, cursor selected, add in a circle. This is great. So right now I'm trying to scale this circle, but it is not allowing me to scale it. So if this happens to you, which it happens to me, this is probably the fourth time, and every time I forget what I'm supposed to be doing. If you're in face mode and you're trying to scale a selection that has no faces, you will not be able to scale it. And so in this case, we created a circle that is just the outline of a circle and the vertices that comprise it, but it has no faces, and so in face mode, scaling actually has no effect whatsoever. So to fix that, we just used here and switched to vertex mode, and now we can scale that down to something much more reasonable. And again, this is the part we're working on here, and so we sort of want to make a circle that's the same radius as that. And in fact, first we're going to rotate by hitting R and Y and hitting 90 degrees to make it perfectly straight here. And now we can scale it down so that's more or less like that. And you know, this is a place where all of these binders are going to look a little bit different. That's what Staples looks like. This is a nice big tab here on this one. And in fact, since these are the binders that we're mimicking, I might go with those and sort of make a slightly bigger one, but get creative, make any kind of binder you want. So for this one, now we have sort of an outline of a circle, but it's not connected and it has no faces. So what we need to do first is bring this up a little bit and then bring it so that it sort of is around an edge. So for that, I'm hitting G and X and just sliding it to about the edge of this box that we're going to connect it to. And then I'm going to hit Shift and D to duplicate it and X to make sure it stays on that X axis. And so now we sort of are starting to have this outline here. Or actually, you know what? I changed my mind. I'm not going to hit Shift D. I am going to hit Shift or G and X to move it over here. And then I'm going to hit E to extrude it along the X axis rather than just duplicating. And that's going to save us some time because it's going to create all of these faces in here for us when we extrude. And that really is going to just make things great for us. It creates a few extra faces we don't need here, but it certainly saves us time. So from there, we're going to hit F to fill in a face there. And if we Alt and click on this ring here, we'll automatically select that whole ring, and we'll just hit F again. And so now we have a nice circular tab that's going to let us pop paper in and out of here. So to finish this up, what we want to do is connect these vertices to this bottom part of the circular ring. And so we're going to want this edge to connect to this edge and so on and so forth. So first thing we're going to do is select this one edge. And then we can go through here and one by one just select some vertices that look like a good match for that edge. And we can just hit F and fill it in with a nice n-gon. And now that edge is complete. And it's going to line up pretty well with all of these. Now, yeah, I think that works. And we're just going to do the same thing over here. So select the same vertices that we just used, and then these last two on this edge and hit F. And then up here, same thing for just these nice 4 vertices here. Make sure there's a face there. And the same thing down here. Make a bunch of faces. And as you can see, if we rotate around here and fly to the other side of our vast binder, our work has been perfectly duplicated on this side as well. The shading is a little bit off, and that's partially something that happens while you're modeling and adding a lot of geometry that you might need to go into the shadings tab here and recalculate your normals. And that will just go through the model and make sure that all of our angles are properly configured. We are still seeing a little bit of weird shading here. Let's just drop into render mode and see. Oh, I'm still in Blender render. No, we want cycles. And let's just recalculate all this just for fun. Take a look at cycles, and cycles usually doesn't care too much about those things. And we're seeing that no real artifacts to speak of. And our binder is looking pretty great. Looks like a binder. And my Wacom lost its connection. Probably going to need to switch this to an actual plug next time. Okay, so going back into our model, that's looking pretty good. We've got our tab roughed out. We've got our binder parts roughed out. So the last thing we need are some rings. No examples of rings here, but here, so we just need 3 of these guys. And so for that, we're just going to use a torus, but with some fairly extreme settings. So what we're going to do here is select this, and once again, we're going to do cursor to selected, and that's just going to put our cursor right where we want it, essentially right in the center and on all dimensions for this back part. And then we're going to hit Shift A and add a torus mesh, which is going to be enormous, but that's okay, because what we're going to do is change some of the dimensions and settings down here. to make sure that it fits with what we want. We're going to hit shading to smooth. Actually, we're not here. Let's delete that and just do it one more time. One thing you should be careful of here when you're adding geometry is that a lot of times this menu, or not a lot of times, but every time, this menu is only available before you make any changes whatsoever to the geometry you just created. And so the very first thing you're going to want to do here is make sure that all of this is sort of configured the right way. And by that I mean this is where you would set how many faces you want on a sphere or something like that, and how precise you want it to be. And this is sort of where you still are able to change some of the parameters that get used to generate this geometry. And as soon as you sort of exit this, you no longer have a dynamic tool for creating geometry. You just have static geometry that then you would have to modify by hand. And a lot of times that's really a pain. So we want this to be perpendicular to where it is right now along the y-axis. And so we're going to go to rotation and y, and we're just going to type in 90, and then that's about right. We also want it to be quite a bit smaller, so we're going to change the, and this is something where you'll probably want to do these back and forth a little bit, because we're really shrinking this down quite a bit. And the reason that we're not just creating this geometry and then scaling it is because with a torus that gets a little tricky, because there's these two dimensions that don't really work very well for the scaling operations you normally do. And by that I mean you've got this radius here that's the entire torus, but you've also got this radius in here perpendicular to that determines how sort of wide this pipe is. And so if you just created it and scaled it, you would not really have the right thing for what we want. And in this case, that is a very thin, almost like a finger ring style dimension to this. And so we're going to actually scale our minor radius down as far as we can, which seems to be 0.1. And then our major is going to be, in this case, actually, because we have not a great deal of precision here, we're just going to try and get a ring that looks like it's got about the right relative dimensions to itself. And so we want something where the overall radius of the ring is related to this minor radius in a fairly similar way to what we're seeing here. And that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to smooth. And now that's going to be smooth. And then we're going to scale that down just with S. And it's going to be close enough. That looks like about what we want here. So we're just going to pull that with G and Y. We can slide that right out here. And we do want that to be sort of embedded a little bit in our sort of back plane that we're using. This is getting a little hard to see. Let me see. Texture mode generally gives us a bit more contrast. And actually this can even come down a bit more. There we go. And then there's one ring. It's okay to adjust this. It's always going to adjust from its own center, and so you can sort of scale it. And a little bit more, and that's looking pretty good, right about there. And now we're going to use another modifier here. So while you still have this ring selected, you're going to add an array. And basically what the array modifier does is makes copies of your object, however many you want, either offset relative to their dimensions or offset some constant amount in Blender. And so in this case we want constant, and we're going to want 3 total for our 3-ring binder. And we're going to want to offset it along the x-axis. And so this is just along the object's y-axis, because we rotated it. Am I lying again? I guess it was x. No, we're talking z now. Okay. And in fact here, what we're going to do with this selected, we're going to hit Control A and then apply rotation. And because we're not going to rotate this again after that, and basically that's going to make our settings for our array much less confusing, let's put it that way. So now our X is this nice red arrow, and if I change my X, the X changes, so that's fantastic. And in this case, since the array doesn't sort of go out from both directions from the center, we're going to hit G and X and move this to about where our ring seems to be relative to the rest of the binder, which seems to be about there, maybe even a little bit further this way. And then when we slide our X, we'll keep even spacing between our rings, and we can slide it like that. And again, if you've seen 3-ring binders, they're not always exactly symmetrical on either side either. So this is a very forgiving object for the beginning modeler, I think. So there's that. And actually, you know what? Our rings are looking a little thin to me. And here's where the power of the array modifier comes in. We just need to, I'm going to go ahead here and just, for fun, just hit scale X. And because I think that these tend to be a little bit wider than they are thick. And that already is feeling a bit better. And actually, I apologize, we're not going to do that in object mode. We're going to hit tab, and this is going to allow us to scale it without repositioning any of the other rings. Scaling in object mode will actually change the position of the rest. The difference basically being that in edit mode, you're moving just the vertices that make an object up around, while keeping the sort of object itself's scale at 1. And maybe this is a topic for another Blender tutorial, but essentially if you want to change the shape of an object without modifying any other copies of it or its relative position to something else, you're going to want to do that in edit mode and work on the vertices directly rather than scaling all of the vertices relative to sort of the parent object. I'm sure that was clear as mud. But in any case, just hit tab, go into edit mode, and we're going to hit scale in X, and basically just duplicate what we just did, but without moving the rest of our rings. And that's looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and jump into rendered mode and just have a look here. And everything always looks pretty amazing in Cycles Render after you make it. Even simple shapes, just the amount of detail that you get in some of these shadows, it's always satisfying to jump in here and see how much you can accomplish even with just some very simple geometry. You're already really getting a sense that this is a real 3-ring binder it's looking pretty good. So I'm going to call that for part 1 here. In the next part, I'll go over a bit more of the detailing that happens in our end caps here. Might even make a nice little cut along here, which will be sort of where these things will split if someone was to push on these tabs. And I'll talk a little bit about making the kind of leatherette texture and bump map up here that's going to determine how the materials and things on this will work. So thanks a lot.